Hello, Nicole Mashburn, and today we're going to talk about neurons, nerves, and neuroglial cells. So what we're going to focus on is really the histology of the nervous system. And there are two main cell types when you're thinking of the nervous system. The first cell type are the neurons, and then you have your neuroglial cells or glial cells. And we're going to focus on the neurons first, and then we're going to come and talk about the neuroglial cells. Now remember, neurons are the cells that are able to be excitable. They carry those action potentials, okay? So the electrical signals that the nervous system uses, they're carried by the neurons. The neuroglial cells or glial cells are your support cells, and we're going to talk about each one of these later on in this talk. So the neuron, we've introduced the neuron to you in the muscle unit, and now we're going to go into a little more detail about it and some things you need to know about it and what the neuron does, what each part of the neuron does. So if you remember, your neuron has what's called a cell body, and sometimes you'll see the word soma and perikaryon. Those are also words. Perikaryon, soma, and cell body are they all mean the same thing. And this is the biosynthetic receptive part of the cell. So inside the soma or the body, you have a nucleus just like all cells have with DNA for making proteins. You have mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi. So all the stuff that you would expect a cell to have, neurons have that as well. Now on the cell body, you have these spiky looking things, and these are called dendrites, and these are the receptive ends of the neuron. So as information input comes from the brain or from another neuron as it's traveling through the nervous system, it's going to come into the dendrite, and these electrical signals are going to be transferred through the cell body to this area, which is called the axon hillock. So these are not actually action potentials traveling through, they're electrical impulses, but not true action potentials. And so the signal will travel from the dendrite through the cell body, and then if there's enough information, enough signal to generate action potential, if you could reach threshold, think back to our muscle unit, we talked about threshold. If you have enough signal, then an action potential will be generated at the axon hillock and travel down the axon, which is this long yellow line here. And so the impulse or action potential direction travels this way. Okay? Now, along your axons, you'll have these blue things. These are called Schwann cells, and we'll talk about what they are. Basically, it's myelin wrapped around the axon. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then between these Schwann cells, you have little gaps. These are called nodes of Ranvier, and they help propagate action potentials. It kind of keeps the action potential going down the axon in the right direction. And then you get to the end of the axon, and you have the axon terminals, and this is the secretory end. So this is where the neurotransmitters are. So if you think back to the muscle unit, we talked about acetylcholine is stored in the end of the axon. So there's a lot of neurotransmitters. So depending on where you are in the body and what the neuron is doing, it'll store different neurotransmitters in these axon terminals. So information, impulses come from the dendrites through the cell body. If there's enough electrical impulse, they'll generate an action potential, travel down the axon, go to the axon terminal, you release a neurotransmitter, just like what we talked about with the neuromuscular junction earlier. So neurons or nerve cells have some special characteristics, a little different than some other cells. Remember we talked about epithelial cells and how they can regenerate, and you're always repairing and maintaining your body, and red blood cells and white blood cells, a lot of connective tissue type cells are always regenerating, and you're making more and more and more of them. Well, neurons are long-lived, and so pretty much what you're born with is what you're going to have. So, for example, the neuron that goes from your spinal cord all the way down to your little toe, you're born with that, and you will have it, that same neuron, all the way until the end of your life. So that makes these cells amitotic. They don't divide, so they can't reproduce, which is different than, like I said, the cells inside your mouth, like the epithelial cells we talked about earlier in the tissue unit. The nerve cells are highly metabolic. They need an incredible amount of oxygen and glucose. So that's one of the reasons that you can't go without oxygen for very long. So a drowning victim or someone who's had a heart attack that's not breathing, you're looking at nerve and neuron damage pretty quickly due to lack of oxygen. And they need a lot of glucose in order for them to function correctly. So you have to have a lot of oxygen, a lot of glucose so that they can survive and function. They also are excitable. They're the ones that can carry electrical impulses, those action potentials. And so they can do this through synapses, which we talked about the neuromuscular junction earlier, and they can also do cell-to-cell interactions embryonically. So before you have made neuromuscular junctions, those neurons still need to be able to communicate with each other so you can have cell-to-cell interactions. So they're very specialized cells compared to some other cells we've talked about so far. Now, because we're doing anatomy, we love to classify. And so we can classify these neurons with function. So what do they do? And you've seen a similar picture up to this earlier. And so the first function of a neuron is sensory. It's input. So you have sensory neurons that take information toward the brain. You have interneurons. Okay, these are the ones that are found in the brain that the computer cells that make the decision and make all the responses and then send the signal out. These are your integration or interneurons. And then you have your motor neurons, which carry the output, so the impulse or the response away from the brain. So your three functional neurons are sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. So think about where those are found and what they do. We can also classify on structure. And so we use the term bipolar, unipolar, and multipolar. And what we're talking about, and I say this kind of tongue-in-cheek, is the number of somethings that are coming off the cell body. So these are cell bodies here, and here, and here. And what we're looking at are how many somethings are coming off of the cell bodies. Well, there's always one axon. Okay, every neuron is going to only have one axon. So what we're really looking at is how many dendrites are coming off of it. So if you have a bipolar cell, so this one is a bipolar cell. So here's my cell body. I have two things coming off of it. One dendrite and one axon, which makes it bipolar. Multipolar, I'm going to draw my arrow way over here. Multipolar, one axon. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In this case, 5 dendrites. So a multipolar is one axon and more than one dendrite. So you have at least 2 dendrites, and it can be 2 or 3 or up to 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 dendrites. So multipolar, one axon and multiple dendrites. Unipolar, a little different. You have one something coming off the cell body that divides into an axon portion and a dendritic portion. Okay, so bipolar has 2 things coming off the cell body, one axon, one dendrite. Multipolar has one axon and multiple dendrites, and unipolar has one process that divides to have an axon end and a dendrite end. And as we study certain kind of neurons and where they're found, a lot of these you'll find in sensory, like retina and things like that. When I mention neurons later on, I might say this is a unipolar or this is a bipolar or a multipolar neuron, and you'll know what that means. So it's a structural classification. Now, we can't use the word neuron and nerve interchangeably. It's an easy thing to do, and sometimes I do it, but they're really not the same thing. The neuron is the actual cell, and the nerve is a bundle of these neurons. So just like a muscle fiber is the cell of a muscle, and you put a lot of muscle fibers together to get a muscle, same thing. So neurons put together make up nerves. So the neuron is the cell that transmits the signal, and then the nerve is simply a bundle, okay? And it's a bundle of those axons in the peripheral nervous system. So think about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. That's where the nerves are. So when you bundle up their axons, you make, in the peripheral nervous system, you make nerves. And nerves can be what we call sensory or motor or mixed. So some nerves only bring sensory information to the brain and spinal cord. Some nerves only take output to the brain and spinal cord, from the brain and spinal cord. And some nerves do both. They can send and receive information because they're separate neurons. You have some sensory neurons and some motor neurons that are forming that nerve. So the nerve can have both sensory neurons and motor neurons. So let's talk about what a nerve looks like, its structure, and hopefully you already have noticed a couple of words and think, looks kind of like a muscle. We have the endo, peri, and epi, just like we have that in the muscle, epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. In the nerve, we use the word neurium. So endoneurium, perineurium, and epineurium. And these are the connective tissue layers around each one of these parts of the nerve. So an individual neuron is surrounded with an endoneurium. You take a bunch of these and bundle them together, making a fascicle, just like in the muscles, and you surround it with a perineurium. Take a bunch of these fascicles and bundle them all up in a layer called the epineurium, and you get the nerve. So the epineurium covers the entire nerve. You have these fascicles surrounded with a perineurium, and then each one of the axons has its own endoneurium. And that's how you make a nerve. Now nerves also need, because they're very metabolic, they need oxygen. So you're going to have arteries and veins associated with them as well, so they have a good blood supply for oxygen and nutrients and glucose and things like that. So when we use the word nerve, remember we're talking about the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so in the central nervous system, we're talking the brain and the spinal cord. So the nerves are the things that come off the brain and spinal cord. So in the cranial nerves, these are the nerves that come off the brain. And most of these, not all, but most of these serve areas inside the head. So for example, you have your olfactory nerve, your optic nerve. These go out to your nose and your eye and serve things going on in your head. Your spinal nerves, these come off your spinal cord. So this would be a spinal nerve, this is a spinal nerve, and they come off in those intervertebral foramen. So when the vertebrae line up on top of each other and you have those little holes, the spinal nerves come from the spinal cord and go through those little foramen. And then they come out, and they a lot of times will form a plexus, which is where they kind of interlace and branch and go out to an area of the body or a limb. So remember, nerves are found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so remember when we talked about histology, we said the nervous system is made up of two types, neurons and neuroglial cells. And so we're going to talk about the different types of neuroglial cells. And the first one are called astrocytes, and astro meaning star. They're star-shaped cells. So this is an astrocyte. So this is a neuron, the yellow one, and then this white one is an astrocyte. And these are the most abundant. They're highly branched, so they look like stars. And I like to call them scaffold cells. So they're support and brace. So they kind of give structure to the nervous system. There is some thought they participate in some information processing in the brain, so they may help the brain with integration. But they're mostly just scaffold. They just kind of hold everything in place. The next one are microglial cells, and these are small, thorny-looking cells. This pink one is a microglial cell, and they're migratory. That means they can move, and they can move toward injured neurons. So I call them nurse cells. So they're phagocytic, so they're kind of like macrophages. And because you have a blood-brain barrier, white blood cells can't get up into the brain and help fight off infection. So you have these microglial cells that do the job of kind of your immune system inside there, inside your central nervous system, and inside between the neurons. So they can, eat bacteria and any kind of debris. So they're your nurse cells. Then you have ependymal cells or ependymal cells. I've heard it pronounced both ways. And inside your brain and spinal column, you have these cavities. And these cavities are fluid filled. And the name of this fluid is called CSF. CSF. And that stands for cerebrospinal fluid. And this cerebrospinal fluid is going all throughout your brain and the cavities, your spinal cord, and surrounding the brain and spinal cord, gives it cushioning, so the brain's kind of floating up inside your skull cavity. And because there's no pump, this fluid would be stagnant. It needs to be able to move. And so these cells are ciliated, and they'll help kind of move that fluid through these cavities and through the spinal cord, because you don't have a brain heart. Okay, so these cells have cilia that keep that fluid moving. All right, so the last type of glial cells are the ones that make myelin, and there's two different types of cells. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But first, what is myelin? And myelin is basically a kind of a protein lipid sheath, kind of a fatty sheath that goes around axons. And so its job is to protect and insulate the axons. So just like you would put a plastic coating around an electrical wire, this is what it does. So it helps insulate the axon, because the axon is essentially an electric wire. And by insulating it, you increase the speed of nerve impulse. So the more insulated it is, the faster the impulse can travel. So that's what myelin does. And I want to throw this in as we talk about anatomy later on, especially in the brain and spinal cord. We're going to talk about white matter and gray matter. Well, when you're looking at the brain and you're going to see what's called white and gray matter, the white matter, what that means, that's where the myelin is. So the fibers that have myelin look white because the myelin's fatty, has a white look to it. And the gray matter are the cell bodies. And so cell bodies don't have myelin on them. So the white matter is where the myelinated axons are, and the gray matter is where the cell bodies are. So who makes myelin? Well, the first one are your oligodendrocytes, and these are in the central nervous system. And an oligodendrocyte is one cell, okay, this is one cell, that sends out these processes of myelin that wrap around these axons. So each one of these yellow things is a different nerve fiber. So this one cell is kind of sending out little processes and insulating all these different nerve cells. So that's an oligodendrocyte, and they're found in the CNS, the brain and spinal cord. Now in your peripheral nervous system, you have Schwann cells. They're also called neurolymnocytes, so either one, Schwann cell or neurolymnocytes. And these are found in the peripheral nervous system, and they also wrap around the axons to myelinate them and insulate them. But instead of it being one cell that kind of branches out, each one of these is a Schwann cell. Okay, so each one of these is an individual Schwann cell. And Schwann cells are also helpful in allowing peripheral nerves to regenerate. One of the key differences between central nervous system and peripheral nervous system is regeneration. So if you damage a nerve in the peripheral nervous system, a lot of times it can regenerate and heal, but in the central nervous, it won't. So a damaged spinal cord or brain damage, an injury to the brain or spinal cord can be permanent because those cells don't regenerate, whereas peripheral nerves, a lot of times they can heal. So if you cut yourself, sometimes the tissue will heal, the neurons will heal, and you won't lose feeling or sensory or motor in that area. Now you can, I'm not saying they don't always heal, but they have a better shot at healing than the ones in the central nervous system. All right, so that's all I'm going to talk about in this video, and I will see you again. Thank you for your attention.